Okay. Chapter 17 is not just about China. It includes China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam also. Now, this might make some of you breathe easier. I'm not going to ask you to learn the names of these dynasties. There were different dynasties for China, dynasties for Korea, and dynasties, not for Vietnam though. In the case of the Japanese, they've only had one family ruling for some 2,600 years. Father and son, family, same family. No one outside the family of the emperor has ever tried to take over the office of emperor. Not in Japan. The emperor was looked on as being a god, and no one could be a god unless he were born one. So so they've only had one family, one dynasty. Now, in the case of the Chinese, though, they would change dynasties every once in a while. Chinese history up to 1905 is based on their dynasties. But we're not going to learn the names of dynasties, and for the most part, we're not going to learn the names of individuals. There is one exception. I do want you to learn Mr. McCartney's name. And I got to looking, and regrettably, he actually belongs in chapter 21, but I accidentally found him on chapter 17. So anyway, Mr. McCartney. No, that's not Paul McCartney. That's Lord McCartney. For those of you who don't know, Paul McCartney is one of the Beatles, one of the four Beatles. Some of you, if you had been born 50 years earlier than you were, you'd probably know that. All right. The primary religion of China during this time period we're talking about, it is a 14, 15, 1600s, up to the early 1700s. The primary religion was Neo-Confucianism. Now, Confucius actually lived in the 300s BCE, 300 BCE. But the Neo-Confucian movement started around the 1200s. Don't worry so much about the dates. But Neo-Confucian philosophers actually believed in investigating things. If they would have continued in this regard, who knows what they would have accomplished. Now, one of them turned against the idea of investigation. He said, I kept staring at a bamboo shoot and it taught me nothing. He should have listened to George Washington Carver, even though George Washington Carver came much later. George Washington Carver was an African-American scientist who studied the peanut and the soybean, and he came up with all kinds of ideas for the peanut and the soybean, including peanut butter, which was still used, and plastics. Soybeans are still a big product thanks to him. But again, the Neo-Confucians, somehow or another, their idea of investigating things did not lead to the same way. Now, I guarantee you, if George Washington Carver would have investigated the Chinese bamboo shoot, who knows what he'd come up with, but probably quite a bit. But the Chinese just didn't have that mentality, and there have been many, many books written. What was the reason the Chinese did not develop technologically and did not outdo the West when they were so far ahead of the West? And one reason was they did not value science very highly. They did not value technology very highly. They did not value inventiveness very highly. I want to insert my own idea here. I think if China had been divided into 50 different countries, one of them would have forged ahead of the other ones. Europe at this time was divided into 200 at least independent nation states, and most of them lagged behind. But Great Britain, Germany, part of the German states, and France forged ahead. And then, of course, the United States also forged ahead. But I've often wondered if China had been divided instead of united, that being united might have hurt them. Now, it is known that the Chinese came to the United States before Columbus. They came to California, but they didn't stay. They had some very, very large ships which they allowed to rot. Their ships went as far as India and even to Africa. Now, the first contacts with the West, the Jesuit missionaries, the Jesuits, whom we talked about, they sent missionaries into China, but the Chinese proved difficult to convert to Christianity for a couple of reasons. Number one, the Chinese only wanted to embrace a religion that they had started. And the two main religions from China was Confucianism was the main one, and Taoism was the other one. Taoism, which was much more spiritual than in the case of Confucius, we don't even know if he even believed there was a God. His religion was very materialistic, very philosophical, with emphasis on the practical. But when Christianity came in, one area where that the Christians came into serious conflict with the Chinese mindset was the Chinese worshipped their ancestors. Not all of them, but a lot of them worshipped their ancestors. Believed that your ancestors became gods when they died. Christianity said, no, you should not worship your ancestors. Your ancestors cannot help you. And as a result, Christianity came into conflict with mainstream Chinese thought. Eventually, the Chinese emperors expelled Christians from China. Now, this was to be true of all these Far Eastern kingdoms, whether it be China, Japan, or Korea. I don't know about Vietnam so much, but all these other kingdoms, China, Japan, and Korea, expelled Christians from their country. Now, I've already mentioned how that the Little Ice Age came in the early 1600s. Little Ice Age, and it had a devastating effect on China. Plagues broke out. Here was the problem, folk. And again, it wasn't the farmer's fault. A farmer would plant the same crop he'd planted the same day, thinking, well, there's going to be no frost here after this, and the frost hit it. Now, here in Georgia, as I've already mentioned, we've experienced the same thing. Just 2 years ago, 2017, the farmers south of us, they already had their blueberry plants planted, and Alma is like the blueberry capital of the country. And then a big winter freeze hit in March and destroyed their blueberry crops and their peach crops. Now again, most of you are probably not aware of it, but this actually happened. But fortunately, we have other ways to get blueberries. In my case, yes, I do have 3 blueberry bushes in my backyard. But the frost hit at a normal time. But now, okay, the frost hit normal time, so it did not hurt my blueberries because my blueberries had not started to grow. Now, for me, April 15th, income tax day, is the day to plant. But one of these years, I might plant my garden on April 15th, like the other farmers around the area do. Plant April 16th, 17th, and a frost hit. It hasn't happened. I've been gardening for more than 35 years. And no frost has ever hit me after, when it isn't supposed to. But here's the thing, if the early frost didn't get you, if the frost in the spring didn't get you, the frost would come in late summer before the crops were ripe and destroy the crops. This led to famine. Famine led to lower resistance to disease. Now, you might not have guessed, you might have, why is this important? Because it appears that our Earth experiences an ice age every 350 to 400 years. If that be the case, then we are due another ice age. I checked MSN weather this morning because there's going to be some storms coming on. It showed pictures of sled dogs in Greenland wading in water. Okay, fine and dandy. And the very next article down told about how that the weather in Oregon is still so cold But it means that they can't plant crops there yet.
It's gonna be like 2030, 2040.
Yeah. Oh, the next ice age?
Yeah.
Okay, 2030, 2040, pretty soon. I mean, you know, this is the last one. Now, it's believed that a little ice age caused the big Black Death in Europe. We know that apparently the climate cooled, but it's difficult to prove it. Again, I wish we had accurate weather records that would go back 1,000 years, folks, but we don't. But anyway, there are periods of cooling. What causes the cooling? I think it's the sun. The sun warms up, cools down, warms up and cools down. Now, an epidemic hit China and just wiped out large segments of its population. And then, of course, a group of barbarians called the Manchu, from where we get the name Manchuria. The Manchu began to get stronger and they pushed south into China until finally a Manchu ruler conquered China and established a new dynasty. China has been conquered at least 3 times by its barbarian neighbors. Why is that important? A lot of times, less civilized people move in and conquer the civilized. That's why it's important. And a hot issue in this country right now is, do we let just anybody in? And a lot of, particularly young women, your age, believe that we should just have no borders open up and let everybody inside. The Romans did that, and they destroyed the Roman Empire. They would come in and settle down and wouldn't pay taxes and steal their neighbors' crops, destroy the empire, and the great Roman civilization with a justice system was replaced with a justice system of, if a man's accused, light up a fire, get some hot coals, and then make him walk on the hot coals. If his blisters heal quickly, he's innocent. I mean, this is in your history books, folk. Or make him lie down on a bed of spikes. If his back heals quickly, he's innocent. If his back festers up and he gets infection, then he's guilty. That was the justice system that took the place of the Roman justice system. And it lasted for hundreds of years. You'll read this in any book on world history. It's in the books that we use here at this college. This is what happens when you... All right, I've said my lines. Now, this is something that's not new. I mean, right today, when the communists took over in 1949, a bunch of Chinese moved to Formosa and set up a resistance on the island of Formosa. Well, this was not the first time it's happened. It happened back in the 1600s also. When the Manchu took over, a bunch of Chinese set up a resistance on the island of Formosa, but eventually the Chinese and Manchu reconciled, the Manchu dynasty, so they got along with each other pretty well. Now, another problem that China had was their scholars began to become very, very introspective, emphasizing meditation, emphasizing morality. Morality is great and wonderful. I believe meditation has a place, but they did not emphasize things like putting gadgets together, like the Europeans. In the meantime, the Europeans were inventing the mechanical clock, learning how to work gears. Mechanical clock is a marvelous piece of technology, you might say. The gear ratio between the second hand and the minute hand has to be 60 to 1. The ratio between a minute hand and the hour hand has to be 60 to 1. Any of you know what I'm talking about? 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. The hands have to be geared. And anyway, While Europeans were inventing the mechanical clock, the Chinese were practicing morality and introspection, or claimed they were. Now, in the meantime, some Russian fur traders moved in, and they would hunt inside China's borders, and they wouldn't pay the taxes on what they hunted. And you might wonder, why couldn't the Chinese send their agents? Well, keep in mind, the border between Russia and China is huge, and Chinese population had been reduced, so the Chinese didn't have enough men to go out and try to find these hunters and collect taxes from them. So they put the Russian hunters under honor, and the Russian hunters would not pay the taxes. So this created problems for China. But the real problem for China came from the Europeans. Around the 1790s, Lord Macartney was sent by the British to China. Lord Macartney carried with him a microscope, a telescope, a pair of eyeglasses, and several gadgets. And one older Chinese man looked at Lord Macartney's glass. "Hey, this is great. I'm seeing like I haven't seen since I was a child." But nevertheless, the Chinese emperor told Lord Macartney, "China does not want to trade with you. You Europeans have nothing to offer us. We don't need your products. Go back home." Lord Macartney went back home. The British decided, well, hey, we're going to trade with them anyway, so they began to force the trade. Yes?
I found
Zinman.
Macartney, it is not MC, it is MA. I searched.
MAC? Oh, thank you. I like Chinese food. I go to a Chinese restaurant fairly often, and the music they played seemed to be music would go on and on and on and on and on and on. And I used to think this represents what I understood the history of China. It was changeless, and it was just stagnant and goes same over and over again. Today's historians say, no, this was not the case. China did undergo a bunch of changes. How much did the West influence them? Would China have changed without the West? These are issues that can't be answered easily. China had long been agriculture and was to remain so until the 20th century. What China consisted of mostly was small villages surrounded by a lot of farms. And you go a few more miles, you'll be in a little small village surrounded by a lot of farms. So that was the old China, and it remained that way for centuries. How much things would have changed without Western influence, we cannot tell. Now, when the Little Ice Age ended, China experienced a big population explosion that has continued to this day. Now, why? Well, due to better diet, for one thing. Now, it was not that the Chinese couples were having more babies. Typically, a Chinese couple would have 8, 10, and 12 babies, thereabout. But during the Little Ice Age, only maybe 1 or 2 of them would grow up. But then, beginning in the early 1700s, they might have 10 babies and 9 of them grow up. Why the difference? Number one, they got better control of smallpox. But number two, their diet got better. So the climate warmed up. Now, folks, this is controversial, but I think I need to say it. The warmer the climate is, the better it is for plant and animal life. When things cool down, plants and animals start to die. The Chinese had a population explosion that is to continue to this day. They have tried to curb their population, but they have not been successful at it. And again, it's owing to the simple fact that diet is better. Now, I'm into genealogy among my other hobbies, and I can tell you on my family history, you look at the family, and this family had 10 children, one of them died in infancy. My grandfather Cunningham, he had 5 children. One of them died in infancy. They always, almost always, my grandmother had 10 children. One of them died in infancy. Infant mortality was pretty high. Today, it's not very common for a child to die. And I know that in every case, in the case of my grandfather, their baby that only lived 9 hours would probably have survived had it been born today. And my grandma's baby, who lived 6 months and 24 days, my mother would always tell him, 6 months, 24, he would have survived if he had been born today. But they got to where the Chinese the couples were having the same number of children, but more and more of them were growing up. So China developed a huge population explosion that they were to continue to have. And all the way up until the 20th century. Your book gives some figures. In the late 1300s, the population of China was probably around 80 million. By the 1700s, late 1700s, the population probably reached 300 million. They did not have the means to take care of that many people. Now, this focus, one reason why a lot of the Chinese wound up coming to the United States in the 1800s. Younger Chinese men, the younger siblings, could not inherit the land, so the younger siblings would often leave China and come to places like Jamaica, Latin America, and the United States. Yes?
Professor Gooding, may I ask, what chapter is this?
This is still chapter 17.
Okay, 17.
Yeah, 17. Yeah, I started 17 last time.
Yes.
Yeah, 17, all right. Now, the Chinese could have taken care of those people if they would have developed manufacturing, but they didn't. You might say, how come we Americans can take care of 300 million people and have a surplus? The answer is we have tractors and reapers and combines and all this equipment. To this day, nobody has found a way to effectively use a tractor or any farm equipment with growing rice. Rice is grown the same way it was 1,000 years ago. It's grown underwater for much of its lifetime, and eventually they drain the paddies, but the rice paddies start out underwater. And again, tractors are ineffective when it comes to rice growing. Well, why did China not develop industry? Some say that the arrival of the Europeans hindered, which I personally doubt. I think that Chinese government regulation hindered more than anything else. Well, again, is any of this, applicable to what's going on today? Government regulation, government interference. Chinese had it. The Chinese taxed their manufacturers really heavy. Farmers were taxed light. Manufacturing was taxed heavy. China had little interest in understanding scientific theory. Now, when we turn over to the next chapter, we're going to learn that Europeans began to study astronomy and they began to explain the universe in ways that had never been explained before. This was very important. The Chinese never did, really. Well, they studied astronomy, but they did not make changes in a way they looked at everything else. So you might ask if I can clarify. This study of astronomy led the way to the development of the other sciences, which we're going to talk about in the next chapter. Astronomy before this time consists of the belief that the Earth was the center of the universe and the whole universe went around the Earth every day. Until the Europeans changed that view, mankind was not to make technological progress. The Chinese never changed that view. But anyway, we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, the Chinese family, most of the time a Chinese family consisted of 3 or 4 generations of Chinese living together. In other words, it wasn't just the father and mother and siblings, but the father and mother, the grandfather and grandmother, and then everyone who had the same great-great-grandparents. The great-great-grandparents might have long been deceased. Why did it need to have such an extended family? Because rice growing is a team effort that takes the efforts of the whole community to work at it together. So if this community might consist of this whole family, the family being about maybe 90 to 100 people or more, who are descended from the same great-great-grandparents. Now, marriages were arranged. Most of the time, the bride and groom had no choice or no say-so in the choice of a marriage partner. The parents would arrange the marriage for the benefit of the family and not the benefit of the bride and groom. This was to go on even until the 20th century. I have to say this, though, their marriages oftentimes lasted better than ours, lasted longer than ours. In the cities, women were generally not seen, but they were in the countryside. They were considered inferior to men. Now, yes,
Didn't they also do some weird, like, shoe fitting stuff there?
that you were about 30 seconds ahead of me. Foot binding. They would put these tight, super tight shoes on their young girls when they were infants in order to make sure their feet did not grow. And this was supposed to make them look more attractive to men. Now, there is another point about that. That it was to keep them from running off. In other words, from escaping. That once their feet were bound. The practice of foot binding was to continue until 1949, when the communists took over and outlawed the practice. But in some places in the countryside, they continued to practice later. The authors of your book say that when they visited China in the 1980s, they saw a few women. The practice, though, I've never seen a Chinese woman with her feet actually bound. Now, I saw pictures of it. I mean, I've just seen pictures. Supposedly now, too, the foot binding changed the shape of their legs, which made them look more attractive to men during the sex act. And that's as plain as I want to get for it. But the nearest practice we have in the United States is the practice of women wearing high heels. And I once asked my mother, why do you women wear high heels? She said, oh, it's to make the women more attractive to the men. And the American women, at least when I was growing up, had problems with ingrown toenails, plantar warts, fallen arches. I hope none of you have any idea what I'm talking about. Oh yeah, corns and bunions. Yeah, okay, none of you know what I'm talking about, I hope, yeah. Anyway, if you don't, you're fortunate. I've had 4 ingrown toenail surgeries myself. Again, having grown up in poverty, I had to often wear shoes longer than I should have. It shoes didn't fit. But yes, I had a problem with a plantar wart one time. And but I don't know. I've never had problems with bunions or fallen arches or thick calluses. But anyway, when I was a kid, though, there were a lot of articles put out about how that we are killing our feet, and 90% of the women had foot problems. Now, I don't know how true it is today. I do know my daughters have never had a corn, or if they have, I don't know about it. They never had a bunion, but they did get plantar warts. Yes, one of them. And wound up, I got one myself one time. Again, this practice was finally outlawed. Now, here, folks, is the next